Dead Men's Secrets, or Dead Men Tell Tales. You've probably watched PBS a time or two and seen a special or some kind of a TV documentary, that details, in some regard, some ancient relics, some ancient buildings, like the Great Pyramid of Egypt. And then they'll give you the numbers that go along with it, like this is the most massive building ever built in the history of the world to this day, as I speak to you today, as you're listening. The Great Pyramid of Cheops is the most massive building. Until about 1935, it was also the tallest building ever built in the world, until the Empire State Building was built back in 1935. The Great Pyramid was the biggest, tallest building in the world. And they'll tell you, some statistics and one thing and another, and then we sit here in awe, and we kind of marvel, because you see, when we go to public school, they tell us that man, years and years ago, was a brute beast evolving from apes, and that we were really pretty dumb, dragging our knuckles on the ground and hitting our women over the head and dragging them off into the cave, And so, if your view of the world, or your world view, is based upon evolution, and then you look at this great pyramid out here, this great building, and you listen to these numbers over here, they don't add up. They don't add up. Now, I'm a general contractor, and I build buildings. And when we build a house, if that house is plus or minus an inch, that's plenty good enough. And when we get them a little out of square, they're 2-3 inches out of square, no big deal. We just cover it up, by dividing the inch or the 3 inches, in half. And then when we put the roofing on, we fudge a little bit over here at the bottom, and then we fudge a little bit up there at the opposite top. And when you look at it, you can't see it. It's not that big a deal. And that's building a house. Now, the Great Pyramid, to show you how accurate it is, in 1964, they developed, I don't know who it was, but somebody developed what they call a laser transit. Now, we've had transits, for hundreds of years. An eyepiece, a telescope, in which we could put a man out there in the field, 100, 200, 300, 400 feet out there. We can measure elevations with a stick, and we can measure straight lines and things like that. It's been going on for a long time. So we've been surveying and measuring, for centuries. But the accuracy of it wasn't all that great. And so we've been making maps, for hundreds of years. But the maps, aren't exactly accurate. And so as time progresses along, we've been getting more accurate maps. And so about 1964, somebody comes up with a new type of transit, and it's called the laser transit, and it's much more accurate, than the old transits. And so as time progresses along, technology improves, and we get more accurate readings. And so somebody went over to the Great Pyramid and they measured it up, and they'll see, well, how square is it? Now, the thing sits on 14 acres. So it's not like building a house. I mean, an acre is 43,560 square feet. So if you can remember, that's about 40,000 square feet. If you've got a house that sits on 10,000 square foot lot, that's a quarter of an acre. You're on round numbers. 11,000 square feet would be a little closer. So if your lot's 11,000 square feet, now, that's a quarter of an acre, and then on that house you build a house, and if you can build that house within an inch or two of square, that's pretty good. And this is modern times. Well, the Great Pyramid sits on 14 acres. Let's just take 14 times 4. 14 times 4. That's 56 times bigger than your lot. 56 times bigger. And if your lot, is an eighth of an acre over here, well, then it's about 112 times bigger. And the thing measures corner to corner on all four corners within 1/2 inch of absolute square. 1/2 inch on 14 acres. Now, like I said, I'm an old-timey general contractor, and I look at that and I say, my God, I couldn't build a house that close. I couldn't build a house on your lot to plus or minus 1/2 inch. Now, it could be done. I mean, if we wanted to spend the time, effort, energy, and the money, we could build a house plumb. I don't know that you could build it out of wood and make it plumb, but I think we probably, if we put our minds to it, we could probably do that out of some other material. Now, the reason I say that that's really a spectacular concept is because when I went to school, they told us that in ancient times, these people, they didn't have pulleys. They didn't have Caterpillar tractors. They didn't have the wheel. They didn't have transits. there was a company back in 1964 also that said that if they were going to build the Great Pyramid, that they could build the Great Pyramid, duplicate it the way it is, and they could mine the block from 2,500 miles away, ship it by rail and barge and boat, build the thing, and put the capstone on it. Now, that pyramid's sitting up there now without any capstone. Well, this company said that they could put it on there, and then they could do it for $32 billion. And that's a $32 billion. Now, that's in 1964 dollars. If you were going to multiply that out, you'd have to double it from 1980 to the present time, so that'd be $64 billion. And then you'd have to probably double that again from 1960 to 1980. I don't know what the inflation rate was in that 20 years, but I guess it was double again. So that'd be 64, and then we got to double again to 128. So talking about it in today's dollars, it'd be about $128 billion. That's a bunch of money. Now, people don't normally go out and just spend $128 billion bucks, just to be spending money or just to be building something. I mean, when you build a building, like the trade towers or the Empire State Building or something like that, there's got to be a return. There's got to be a reason. There's got to be a purpose behind it. And that's a big building. By the way, the building is built with expansion joints. For those of you that might not know what that is, when the sun shines on the Golden Gate Bridge, it's built out of steel, and it expands. And you've got to have expansion joints. So when you're driving on the deck of the bridge, you'll cross over a grate. And that grate is interlocking like the fingers on your hands. And as the sun shines on the steel, it expands and contracts an inch or 2 or 3 or 5. I don't know how much it expands, but it's got an expansion joint in there. Well, the Great Pyramid, when the sun shines on one side of it, it will expand faster, expand more than on the side where the sun isn't shining. So you've got to have a modality for the entire building to expand, or at least that outer shell to expand and contract. And they've got grooves. The builders of the Great Pyramids understood expansion and contraction. And so they built it into the Great Pyramid. That thing's been there for several thousand years, and it hasn't cracked and broken and fallen down. That's amazing. The Empire State Building hasn't been there for several thousand years, neither has the Golden Gate Bridge or the Bay Bridge. And, of course, the Twin Towers, they didn't last very long. Now, it would say to me that the people who built the Great Pyramid must have had at least the same technology that we had in 1964 to measure it. Just my common sense says to me, if we couldn't measure the damn thing until 1964 because we didn't have a laser transit, then the people that built it had to have at least had the technology of a laser transit to build it. Because up until 1964, boys and girls, we couldn't duplicate it without the laser transit. So whether the guys who built the thing, and I was told this one time, I said, well, how did they level it up? Now the thing sits plumb. It's level. And now they got satellites out there in space with lasers, and they can shoot and they can measure things now pretty darn accurately, and they kind of marvel. I do. I'm an old-timey general contractor, and I got to tell you, I don't think I could build an outhouse that close. I've got 2 outhouses out here, and they're not plus or minus a half an inch. First of all, nobody would spend the time trying to make it that close. It isn't necessary. But then when this thing sits on 14 acres and it's plus or minus plumb, and then it's plus or minus a half inch on 4 corners, sitting on 14 acres, which is bigger than the Empire State Building, which is bigger than the Twin Towers, which is more accurate than either. You got to sit there and say, hey, wait a minute. These guys were not savages dragging their knuckles on the back of the ground. These were not Cro-Magnons. We can't duplicate the thing today. Now, that tells me they got to be smarter than we are. Now, if we could duplicate the thing today, we'd have 4 or 5 of them sitting out there. And you don't see anybody building those today. Now, there had to be a reason for it. I don't know what the reason was. And that's another thing. People don't spend $32, $64, or $128 billion, building the most massive building that's ever been constructed in the history of mankind without a purpose. We haven't got a clue. Can't figure it out. Nobody's spending $128 billion today to build something over there in Washington, D.C. to commemorate World War II. We don't have the money, number one. Number two, if we had the money, we couldn't duplicate it. Don't know how. We don't know how they did it. Well, the guy that wrote the book, Dead Men's Secrets, his name is Jonathan Gray. He he hits upon this very subject matter over here. In fact, it isn't just the Great Pyramid. He hits upon a number of areas of life, like geography, astronomy, cosmology, mathematics, metallurgy, large-scale construction, construction techniques, social organization, engineering, mechanical devices, everyday items, clothing, art, medicine, flight, space travel, ancient science, and civilization. Can you imagine space travel before Christ? Ancient science before Christ, civilization before Christ, flight, medicine, art, and clothing before Christ, equal to or superior to anything that we have today. Now, right away, somebody says, well, if that were true, we would have heard about it from archaeology. You would? You would? Excuse me. In 1940, there was a skeleton up here in the museum in Chicago. I think they call it the Museum of Natural History. It was a 14-foot skeleton. Now, the Bible says there were giants on earth in those days. This is back in Genesis chapter 5, I believe it is, verse 6. There were giants on earth in those days. That does not fit with the theory of evolution. It doesn't fit with modern science. Now, go into that museum today, and you're not going to find that 14-foot skeleton that was there in 1940. I don't know what happened to it. I'm just telling you that in 1940 it was there. Today it's gone. It doesn't fit with the theory of evolution. And I first of all want to tell you that that is not science and that is not academic. That is propaganda. If it doesn't fit with your theory, what you do is you destroy it. You eliminate it. Get rid of it. And that's not honest. And then it's not intellectual. So when I hear stories like that, I say to myself, well, why would archaeology, why would science, why would people in museums want to deliberately destroy the evidence? I mean, if there were giants, then why don't we say, well, gosh, there were giants. That's the truth. How many of these giants were there? Well, now, it could be that the 14-foot giant was just an anomaly. You know, it happens once in a while. You look in the Guinness Book of Records, there was a guy that was just, I think it was 8'11", or 8'10.5" or something, just a shade under 9 feet tall. And the Bible talks about a guy named Goliath. You know, there's David and Goliath. There's a Bible story there. Well, Goliath was 9'6". And compared to the giants described in the Bible, Goliath was a midget. You know, 9 feet is pretty tall when you're comparing it to a 6-foot man, but 14 feet. And there was the story of a guy named King Og, and his bedstead was 14 feet. So the 14-foot skeleton that was in the Chicago Museum was an average run-of-the-mill 14-foot skeleton. There were people that were 15, 16 feet tall. And I suppose there were people that were 9, 10, 11, 12 feet tall. But they're all big. They're big guys. Now, are there any other skeletons beside that one in the Museum of Natural History in Chicago? And the answer is yes, by the hundreds. They've been discovered all over the world. And Dead Men Secrets identifies the locations of those finds. And I didn't know that before. So I had heard of the Great Pyramid. I had heard of the Nazca monuments out here in the desert where they get spiders and monkeys, you know, that are miles across, 6, 8 miles across. And big buildings with building blocks that weigh 50 tons down in Peru and Ecuador. And cities that are built on cliffs and on top of mountains, you know. And those are just one here and one there and one. It makes you think, well, my God, were there people out here in ancient times smarter than we are today, more technologically advanced? Did they have ships that could go across the oceans? Before the flood, flying in jet airplanes, they had medicine equal to today, art, clothing, and mechanical devices that have been dug up, but they don't fit the theory of evolution. See, evolution is a fairy tale for adults that tells us once upon a time, long, long ago and far, far away. And then they proceed to tell us the story about how billions and billions of years ago, thus and such occurred. Pure fantasy. There isn't a shred of evidence, not a shred of proof. No scientific tests can be duplicated. And, you know, if people want to believe that, that's fine. There's no problem with that. People believe in religion. I kind of watch people, you know, religious people. They scare the hell out of me, and I watch them as far away as I can get from them. And then they believe in superstition. And rational people who attach themselves to science, they attach themselves to another superstition called evolution. And they call that science. I look at both of them and I say, oh, my God, I got one superstitious bunch on the one hand, and I look over here and I got another superstitious bunch on the other hand. And neither side can ever come to an actual grasp of truth and understanding. You know, how did it actually happen? So in order for us to do that, if we're going to arrive at the truth, we got to actually come to grips with 14-foot skeletons and buildings that are so big and so massive that we can't duplicate them today, and ask the question, well, how did those people build that? Who was here to do that? We look at Stonehenge, in amazement to this day, and say, how in the world did those people get 30-ton blocks of rock sitting up there on top of that? That would be a whale of a feat. It can be duplicated. We could do Stonehenge. But hey, boys and girls, there's a lot of buildings around the world that we can't duplicate today. There's a block of rock in a wall down in Ecuador that weighs 200,000 tons. It's a dressed rock. It's a square. I say square, it's rectangular, but it's got corners to it. It's got 8 corners. And these corners, are exact. It didn't just evolve this way. If you're out here walking around, and you see a block of rock over here and this thing is square, and you measure it up and it's got the same measurements all around it, you can be pretty sure that some intelligence over here squared that thing up. Here's the crazy part of it. Do you know how much 200,000 tons is? That's a lot of weight. That's a big chunk. Let me describe it. The Titanic, that big ship, the Titanic, and the Queen Mary, these big merchant ships. Well, those big luxury liners weigh about 40,000 tons. 40,000 tons. All right, now let's pull the Queen Mary into a shipyard, and let's just stick it under a couple of cranes, and let's just pick it up and set it on the ground. Do you think that there's any place in the world that there's a crane big enough to pick up a ship like the Queen Mary? Well, I'm here to tell you that there isn't. So when they want to work on a ship that big, what they have to do is run it into what they call a dry dock. That's a big hole in the ground that they can flood with water. They can float the thing in, and then they let the water out of it, and the thing settles down on the bottom, and then they can go in there and then go to work on it. So when we want to work on a ship, we have to put it in a dry dock. You can't pick it up. Now, there are places that have cranes that pick up fishing boats and just pick them up out of the water and stick them over here on the ground, and then they work on them, and then they pick them up off the ground, and they set them back in the water. Fishing boats and things like that. Now, let's go down here. I told you there's a rock here that's now 200,000 tons. There's lots of rocks that are 50,000 tons. That's as big as or bigger than the Queen Mary. There's lots of rocks that weigh 200 tons. They go anywhere from 3, 6, 16, 30, 50 tons, things like that. And these rocks are set into walls, and they're dressed. Some of them are square. Some of them are odd shapes, and then the odd shape fits with the next rock, and it's cut in an odd shape to fit. Kind of like looking at a puzzle. The odd shapes that go into a jigsaw puzzle? And remember that the tab has to fit into a corresponding hole. And then when you're doing a jigsaw puzzle, if you'll think about it, yeah, it's true, you got a tab and you got a hole, but they don't fit together perfectly. So if they don't fit together perfectly, well, then obviously it doesn't go there. All right, well, these rocks are built like a jigsaw puzzle. They're so close together you can't stick a knife blade between them. So they were cut. There isn't any technology today that can cut rock irregularly and then put them together. None. Doesn't exist. And yet there they are. Now, those people that did that were smarter than we are today. They had a greater technology than we have today. And the Bible talks about that, and the Bible talks about space flight. The Bible talks about flight. And yet your preacher doesn't talk about that because if he did, he wouldn't last long as your preacher. Because he subscribes to evolutionary philosophy, and he doesn't tell you everything that's in the Bible. And unless you read it for yourself, you wouldn't know that. And most religious people don't read the Bible. They haven't got a clue. So atheists and agnostics and evolutionists, they don't read the Bible because they don't want to. The religious guys, they don't read the Bible because I'm not sure that they're capable. I mean, everybody's got one, but they don't read it. And if they read it, they don't believe what it says. I mean, time and time again, you take a look at people's actions, in life. People don't practice Exodus chapter 12. Jesus asked the question. He said, well, why do you people call me Lord, Lord, and do not the things which I say? That's because they've got a different God. They've got a different religion. They've got a different program over here that they follow. They don't follow the Scripture. Well, anyway, Jonathan Gray over here writes a book called Dead Men's Secrets. And I want to tell you a little story here, pertinently. William Prescott, the great archaeologist, reminds us that a nation may pass away and leave only the memory of its existence, but the stories of science that it has gathered up will endure forever. You see, folklore is a fossil of history. It preserves history in the